Hello, and welcome to the Community IT Innovators Technology Topics Podcast, where we discuss nonprofit technology, cybersecurity, tech project implementation, strategic planning, and nonprofit IT careers. Find us at communityit.com.
Welcome. My name is Carolyn Woodard, and I'm the Director of Outreach for Community IT. We always have so much good information to pack into our webinars that today we are trying something different. 3 of our senior executives and engineers interviewed each other on emerging trends in high tech that we get asked about and how they will impact the nonprofit sector. I have edited these interviews into 3 episodes, and I'm happy to start out with this discussion, which is on virtual and augmented reality and where this technology might be going, and when it might become standard at nonprofits and how it might be useful. They also touch on how meetings have changed in the pandemic and what meetings might be like in the future. I'll let our experts introduce themselves and get right into the discussion.
So my name is Johan Hammerstrom. I'm the CEO at Community IT. I've been with Community IT for 23 years, and I started off on the technical side and then moved into management. But I miss the technology, and I like talking about it with nonprofits specifically, but also any of my colleagues who are willing to still let me pretend like I'm technical. You know, I'm happy to have these conversations. So I'm happy to be here today with Steve. Steve,
Sure.
You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Steve Longenecker. I'm the Director of IT Consulting at Community IT. I have been at Community IT for 18 years. I know that because I joined Community IT about a month after my son was born, and he is at his first year of college now. So that's how I mark the passage of time for myself and my career at Community IT. I also really enjoy technology, obviously, working at an IT company, and look forward to this conversation with you, Johan.
My name is Nura Aboki. I'm an IT business manager and a senior consultant at Community IT. I have been at Community IT for 13 years. Currently, I advise our clients on best practices for managing technology infrastructure. I also conduct technology assessments, develop IT plans, and build strategic IT roadmaps, including budgeting for our clients. So it's really great to be with you, Johan, and I look forward to our conversation about future trends in IT and the nonprofit sector.
Sometimes it takes a long time for technology to become mature, you know, and even though we all saw the cloud was coming, even though we all saw that mobile devices were going to be a big deal, it took a long time. It took 10 years in some ways for that to kind of work itself out as consumer and business ready technology solutions that could be, you know, implemented effectively and at a reasonable cost. So, you know, cloud is not like a buzzy term at all anymore. It's become sort of so common, so much the normal way that technology is hosted and implemented, that it almost doesn't make sense to talk about cloud anymore because it's just the standard, you know.
Right.
And so as we think about where technology is going over the next 10 years, and specifically like some of the things that are the buzziest right now, I think it's important to remember that it could take a while. Like, we don't exactly know where these things are going. And if anything, I feel like it's even less certain now. Like what's coming over the next 10 or 15 years, to me, feels even less certain than things like cloud and Office 365 felt back in 2012. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions about what's happening next with technology that makes it hard to predict what's going to happen. So it can make some of the buzzy things seem far-fetched or unrealistic, but I think the reality is that most of the tech that's like buzzy right now, or that gets a lot of hype, will probably eventually turn into something that we are all using in some form or fashion. Once Microsoft figures out how to, you know, commercialize it and incorporate it into their product scheme. but the buzzy, when I think of like IT buzzwords, obviously AI, artificial intelligence,
Sure.
machine learning, virtual reality, and crypto are the ones that I think always seem to come up. So it's not, and I don't think any of those technologies are purely hype. I think there's some potential area of development with each of those, and some interesting things that are starting to happen in those different areas.
Right. Maybe it's not as buzzy, but maybe another trend that is sort of sneaking up on us, but is also probably in that kind of time range. As I wonder about like not so much the demise of the traditional document, but like this idea of going paperless, is has been around since 2012, I'm sure, and in some ways has in fact matured to the point that I think there's a lot less paper floating around than there was 10 years ago, for sure. But the fact that there are now so many more ways of sort of disseminating information that aren't like hearkening back to something that you would print out. You know what I mean? Like it used to be the case that you would, if nothing else, you could always print it if you wanted to. And I think we're seeing more and more things now that are like, you can't really print it anymore. Like you only can sort of interact with it on a screen, I guess, right now. And maybe at some point, it won't even be on a traditional screen. It'll be on a VR, headset that you have to interact with this information, So that's kind of exciting to think about. And I know that, there are startups that are, trying to change the way documents work, what they are, and they're documents 2.0 almost, and they're not. And so, you talked about Microsoft and how that's the mark at which the technology has matured is when Microsoft has finally been able how to productize it for their purposes. And there's a lot of truth to that. But I also wonder whether, and I'm not predicting the end of Microsoft at all. They've been really, for a huge corporation, impressively nimble in sort of changing their approach from sort of being a Windows-centric company to a services Microsoft 365-centered company. But so much of their power comes from the fact that people still really live in Word and Excel. At least I do. But I'm old, my son's 18 now. So I wonder whether, coming up more and more that reliance on the traditional document will ease, and if that'll change things. And I wonder whether, virtual reality will be part of that. Like that would change things if you could look at data sort of three-dimensionally and not just on something that you print, onto a piece of paper.
I think that's a really great insight, the whole like moving to a printerless world. And I think there is like a generational aspect to it. I remember I happened to go to a number of baseball games this year, and at a variety of different ballparks. And it wasn't that long ago. Like I remember going to see the Nats in like 2015, 2016, and you could buy your tickets online, but then you had to print them out and carry these like printouts with you down to the ballpark. And now like it's all the default is it's on your mobile device. And if you want to go to the trouble of printing your tickets out, you have to go through a lot of extra steps. And so right. I think in a lot of different parts of our society, I think the pandemic really pushed that along because people, I think, probably were printing a lot of stuff at work. And when they couldn't go to work to use the printer, and it's like, well, I don't have access to a printer anymore. All right, well, we've got to like move to a printerless society and find ways to convey information without a printer.
Right.
And I think young people are way beyond that. They don't really they can't recall a time when you would actually print something out and sign it, physically sign it. Like it just doesn't, those things make less and less sense to them. And it's interesting that pretty much all legal contracts now are docu-signed, with a few exceptions. Like our bank, requires us to physically sign certain documents, but most documents are docu-signed. And the format of DocuSign, which is you go into a website and you click a button, and what that button does is it puts like a sort of recreation of your physical signature on an electronic document. It's so antiquated. Like it doesn't.
I know it is
imagine
strange.
Like 20 years from now,
right?
No one's going to be doing that anymore.
Right. No, that's true. So we were talking about virtual reality, and we have, there's a bunch of these topics we can hit on, but like what are the use cases for virtual reality that you could imagine hitting the nonprofit space at some point? I mean, right now my sense is that the headsets are too clunky, they're heavy, they're expensive, they're not that high res, the battery's not long enough. I mean, there's all these problems that are the same problems that, at one time, if you wanted to have a mobile device, you were carrying around like a briefcase and that was your mobile device. That was a long time ago, but I remember those days. Mm-hmm. And then at some point, they got it into a size that would fit in your pocket, and then it just became more powerful than the computers used to be not that long ago. So one can imagine that that they'll solve the engineering challenges of the mobile device. But what are the business cases that sort of driving this investment that people are envisioning? Obviously, you can have virtual meetings that are much richer than the one we're having now, where you're just a flat image on in a window that I'm looking at on my computer screen. It would be, the idea that we're both wearing some sort of lightweight helmet type thing, and it feels like we're actually in the same room together. Sounds really cool. I'm not convinced it's all that compelling, although you and I both listen to a podcaster that has experienced it and says that it really is a different experience, and it really does feel like you're in the same room, and there's something powerful about that. And we both obviously have our community IT provide services to clients that have spent a lot of money to build out conference rooms to provide that experience to the best of their ability, for the board of directors, when 3 members can't physically be in the conference room, they want that experience for those members to be as good as it can be. So they don't go cheap. They have a nice AV system in their boardroom or their conference room, and I guess a VR headset will someday displace that. What else would do you think VR does? Is it mostly is that it probably? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it maybe takes over that job. Mm-hmm. Although it's funny that you mentioned the AV systems, because if there's one component of the modern office's IT that is unreliable, difficult to use, and eternally frustrating, it's audiovisual systems. So
absolutely,
even getting those to like the stability that the rest of the IT environment has would be a win. Much less like getting it into the realm of virtual reality, which is, as another aside, like one of my big skepticisms of VR is there's sort of a lot of hand waving that goes on, like when we figure out all the technical challenges, and it's like, well, that's not an aside, like that's actually the key issue. And if there's certain, like, the laws of physics have certain limitations that simply cannot be overcome, and it's not, the things we have today are incredible, and there's no reason to think that, like Apple, for example, who's supposedly working on a VR headset and has done some remarkable things with technology. It seems like if anybody were able to figure out how to make VR work, it would be Apple. But there's no guarantee that it will. But if it does, I also wonder if it doesn't just, it also sort of transforms, like it creates new ways of working that are hard for us to imagine yet,
Right.
because we don't have them.
That's what I was talking about, like with the 3D presentation of data. Like that's just sort of hard to imagine, but like that could potentially be really powerful. The way that, Power BI and the visualization of data now, like you just couldn't do it before those systems came into being. The data visualization is kind of that's kind of a new thing that is enabled by technology. I mean, it's not that new, but it didn't, back when I was in grade school, we would make our graphs on graph paper, and it's just so much faster now. So the idea that you could add another dimension to your data analysis visualizations is kind of cool. That's kind of cool.
Yeah. And think back to like Facebook and Twitter in 2006, before the iPhone came out. They were browser based, like you got to Twitter and you got to Facebook by going to a website on your desktop and posting and scrolling and reading. And on the one hand, like what those apps do on mobile is in theory similar, but the social and human impact that having those apps with you all of the time has completely changed sort of how they get used and how their use impacts society. It wouldn't have the same level of impact if it weren't happening in a mobile way. So there could be subtle changes to how we work that VR brings about that we just have a hard time anticipating. VR and AR and kind of the different possible use cases, and noting that Facebook had signed an agreement, Meta entered into a partnership with Microsoft. And the thinking is that Microsoft is interested in creating a VR experience for teams, so that when you meet with somebody, you could meet with them, in more of a virtual reality environment. But you could imagine, like in medical environments, like AR could be useful. I mean, what do I know about surgery, right? So I'm just making stuff up, but
Yeah, that it has potential in training, remote training for volunteers, and
remote training.
In a variety of sectors. And I know that the first AR example I saw was through a mechanic, where they will ask you to put on this glass, and then they will walk you through how to fix your car or a component in your car. So, but that's just when I first got introduced to it. But I know, so it definitely has a lot of potential for us in the tech sector, providing support, as well as even our clients that do volunteer. They can train their volunteers in a variety of programs using AR.
Someone else suggested, I mean, it's not my idea, but the fact that VR is, if you can put a helmet on your head and see like this huge, field of vision with all this sharp graphics, that one of the things that that I find frustrating, right now I'm sitting in my home office and I have my laptop, but I also have a nice big, very large screen right next to it, and I can really have a lot of different windows open at the same time, and that creates a lot of efficiencies for me. But if I take my laptop out of my home office, then I'm suddenly back down to my 14-inch screen, and it just my efficiency is it's not like I can't get work done, but it definitely is impacted by that. And this idea that perhaps at some point what we need to carry around is hopefully a not too big, thing that just sort of gets right over your eyes, and then you suddenly have like not an infinite workspace, but you could actually go even further over and see even more words and texts and graphics that you're working with, and that's kind of cool. I've also I know that Microsoft, they have some sort of VR or augmented reality is like the other thing, and this idea that if they're ubiquitous enough and cheap enough that all of our clients might have them, and they can flip one on, and then I can have my perspective can be the perspective of the person that I'm talking to, and they can walk over to the server room, there won't be a server room because everything's in the cloud. It's 10 years from now or whatever. But whatever. If there's something that needs to be solved on premise, I can sort of see what they're seeing and can even maybe point in their field of vision. Look at that. That's what I want you to look at. Whereas now, when those situations occur, it's and they do occur. Okay, so do you see a black thing about the size of a cigar box? Which of course, I realized. When was the last time any of us bought a cigar or used a cigar box? Except my grandfather had lots of them. And he's long gone now. But holding screws and nails and stuff. But whatever. But my point is that that would be great to have that kind of headset-y thing where you can it can be a camera onto a real reality, but that can then be sent back over the internet to someone else, and they can see what the person's seeing. It does seem like something that could have enough uses that there is probably money to be made, which is always the question: is there money to be made? And people invest in these things on the faith that there's money to be made to some extent. But that investment the technology will get better. Whether it gets to be good enough, your skepticism on that is noted. And well, I don't know, but I think it's going to come. The stuff is. Yeah, and
come. I think what you hear is that augmented reality is probably happening sooner than complete virtual reality. And right. You could imagine, at a data center, like Amazon's data center, Microsoft's data center, they just have rows and rows of racks and racks filled with servers. And all of those servers have components that are being monitored and managed. And if something fails, if you could plug that into a set of augmented reality glasses, then the engineer just walks into the server room, and the augmented reality glasses start lighting up arrows that sort of lead them to the rack. They look at the rack, and there's the augmented reality overlays red over the server that's failed. And that seems to me like a really compelling use case. And especially for those large tech companies, that's the kind of sort of augmented reality solutions that may already be in place, or that, they're most likely to be the early adopters for.
Right. The other thing that we should probably turn to other topics, but I will say that we can just go ahead and give a shout out. The blogger and podcaster that I was talking about is a guy named Ben Thompson, and he writes a lot about technology. He does a lot of analysis of technology and technology companies, and he is, because of that, he was trialing. I guess they were the Quest 2. So this is Meta's product or Facebook's Meta's product that's not the newest, greatest one, but the one that has been out for a little while. And he was using them for virtual meetings with his team of developers and so on. And he was just saying that it really made a different experience of the meetings than a Zoom meeting. And not to say that's a single data point, so who knows? But it's interesting that he was getting that experience with what I'm sure 5 years from now will be viewed as a very antiquated, very old-fashioned, piece of equipment. And yet he, it's kind of like going back to the games that I played when I was a kid, on computer games. I mean, I played computer games, and if you go back and you look at them, is like the pixels the graphics are quote unquote terrible.
Mm-hmm.
But I had a lot of fun playing those games, and I'm not trying fun and productive. I'm mixing them here, okay? But my point is that it could be that we don't realize, because we haven't had a chance to use this equipment enough, and it hasn't become part of our regular lives enough, and that might just happen over time anyway. It may not take the most incredible. You may not need to feel like you're in real reality when you put these things on for it to still feel like it has a real good use case. In other words, I may be interacting with you in virtual reality, and you may look like a cartoon figure instead of like Johan. And I'm like, that's not Johan. That's a cartoon version of Johan. Anybody can see that. I'm done with this, and I take it off and I throw it away. That may not happen. I might be like, that's a cartoon version of Johan, but it's still like somehow creating a sense of presence, and it's really still working.
Yeah.
And that could happen. And if that's the case, there is a technology improvement. I think the heaviness and the battery and just like the degree of trouble it is to put this thing on and take it off, and some of the motion sickness stuff. There's some things that need to be solved. But like, I'm not sure that the graphics need to become like, oh, I feel like I'm in reality, like in science fiction movies, for it to start really being useful. And that's an interesting trade-off, because if that's true, then really it's a matter of like solving some of the like not such a hard lift, getting the heaviness down, getting the battery better, and that's gonna, I don't think, be that hard. And then it's a matter of sort of changing our habits, and that might take a while. But we've already seen how much more we're using Zoom than we were. Now, it took a worldwide pandemic maybe in some ways to get that to happen, but I think that was an accelerant. I think, in fact, we are all more comfortable having virtual meetings and we barely ever use the telephone anymore.
It's pretty. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example of how things can change both quickly but also subtly, and the degree and the extent to which small improvements can have an enormous impact, right? Like the fact that we're able to talk over video and not rely solely on a phone call, I think has made an enormous difference for everybody, running businesses and organizations over the course of the pandemic. Like I just can't imagine having to do all of this solely through phone calls, which would have been the case 20 years ago, probably 15, maybe even 10 years ago.
Right. Not just because we can see each other, but because we can share our screens. I mean, that's really been...
We can share screen. Yeah. Like there's so much more interaction that can happen.
Right.
And when you consider this compared to what might be coming 15, 20 years from now, this is going to feel rudimentary. But what's interesting is that Skype was around in 2005, I think. Right. I mean, like this sort of video calling has been theoretically available for 15 years, but it wasn't really until, 2017, 2018, that it started to become a real option. Like there were bandwidth issues, there were technology issues. I mean, Zoom really and Microsoft, once again, is so illustrative, because how many versions of this did they do? They had Link, they had Skype, they bought Skype, they had Skype for Business, and we used all of those, and they were all terrible. They were pretty much unusable. Right. And then suddenly, somehow, Teams was like, well, actually, Teams seems to work pretty well. Right. And
still not perfectly, but
it's not perfectly. Yeah. But the format is kind of the same as what we were trying to do back in 2005, but they finally figured the technology out. So the minimum viable, which is, I think, what you're saying. Like, what's the minimum viable product here?
That's part of it, and some of that was just like, bandwidth. That's just like, and the fact that we all have enough bandwidth at our homes is driven, more by the fact that some of us grew up with teenagers in the house that wanted to be able to do their gaming, or we wanted to stream Netflix. I mean, I wonder how much those things are all like flywheels, right? Like Netflix can't exist without bandwidth, but the presence of Netflix and the fact that everyone's chattering about whatever the latest, greatest streaming show is, drives those of us who don't have it yet to buy more bandwidth,
right?
Which if there's more people buying more bandwidth, the bandwidth delivery companies can get more efficient, because more customers on the block means, that drawing that cable down to that block gives them more revenue, so they don't mind doing it, and then they can deliver cheaper prices to each, so all of these things reinforce it. And then once in a while, not that we should be asking for this, but like the pandemic was like an accelerant, like it just like lighting a match to all the ingredients were in place, and then suddenly the whole world adopted Zoom and Teams and whatever else is out there, because they suddenly couldn't go to their offices anymore, at least for a while. So it's interesting.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 of this discussion on high tech and nonprofits. You can find part 2 and 3 if you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can get in touch with us on our website to suggest future topics you'd like us to talk about.
Community IT does these free webinars and podcasts for our community, and we love sharing our knowledge and experience. If you have more questions or are having trouble with your IT at your nonprofit, please get in touch with us on our website, www.communityit.com, so we can start a conversation or schedule an assessment. Downloading any of our free resources there will get you signed up for our webinar reminders, and you can attend our next webinar in real time and ask our experts your own questions. If you love podcasts, please subscribe and leave us a rating to help others find this leadership resource for nonprofits.